September 17th, 1912. Lower East Side, Manhattan. Dr. Samuel Weissman pushes through the crowd gathered outside 247 Rivington Street. The tenement building looms 7 stories high, its fire escapes crowded with residents who refuse to go back inside. He counts 13 bodies on the sidewalk, covered with blood-soaked bedsheets. The screaming started 3 hours ago. A police officer stops him at the entrance. "Doc, you don't want to go in there." But Weissman has already seen the wounds, deep tearing bites, shredded clothing, and something else, foam mixed with the blood, a peculiar yellow tinge that makes his stomach turn. Inside apartment 3B, he finds what the officer was warning him about. A Pomeranian, no bigger than a house cat, stands in the corner. Its white fur is matted with gore. When it sees him, it doesn't bark. It just stares with eyes that seem entirely wrong, filming over with a milky white substance. Then it charges. What Dr. Weissman would discover in the following weeks would expose one of the most calculated acts of biological terrorism in American history. A massacre born not from madness, but from methodical burning revenge. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the Pomeranian Plague that terrorized New York City, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. We bring you the darkest, most forgotten chapters of history that mainstream sources one at touch. Drop a comment, telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's descend into one of the most disturbing revenge plots ever conceived. The Powder Keg, Lower East Side, 1912. To understand what happened on Rivington Street, you must first understand the world that created it, a world of crushing poverty, explosive tension, and systematic exploitation that turned Manhattan's Lower East Side into the most densely populated place on Earth. By 1912, over 2.7 million people were crammed into Manhattan's tenement districts. The Lower East Side alone housed 400,000 souls in less than 2 square miles. Imagine 200,000 people per square mile, density that made Calcutta look spacious by comparison. Families of 8 or 10 lived in apartments with 3 rooms and no windows. Children slept in shifts. The air itself seemed thick with desperation. The tenements rose 7 or 8 stories high, blocking out the sun completely on the lower floors. Tuberculosis killed 1 in 7 residents. Infant mortality reached 40% in some blocks. The streets smelled of rotting garbage, horse manure, and the particular stench of poverty that soaked into the brick and mortar itself. Into this nightmare came the immigrants, waves of them. Italians, Jews from Eastern Europe, Russians, Poles, Germans, each group clustered together for safety, creating ethnic enclaves within the broader ghetto. They worked in sweatshops for 12, 14, 16 hours a day. They sent their children into the factories at age 10. They dreamed of something better while drowning in something worse. The landlords who owned these human warehouses became some of the wealthiest men in New York. They charged exorbitant rents for apartments barely fit for animals. When tenants complained about rats, collapsing ceilings, or frozen pipes, the landlords did nothing. What were the tenants going to do? Move somewhere cheaper? There was nowhere cheaper. But among these landlords walked men who had themselves climbed out of the tenement world. Men who remembered what it felt like to be powerless. Men who had transformed themselves from victims into victimizers. Men like Heinrich Vogel, the landlord, a study in transformation. Heinrich Vogel arrived at Ellis Island in 1887 at age 19, carrying everything he owned in a canvas bag. Born in Pomerania, a region stretching between modern-day Germany and Poland, he came to America after his family's farm was seized by Prussian authorities. He spoke broken English. He had no skills beyond basic carpentry and animal husbandry. For 15 years, Vogel worked. He did every degrading job the city offered. He hauled ash from coal furnaces. He cleaned slaughterhouses. He collected rags from the streets and sold them to paper mills. He saved every penny with a discipline that bordered on pathological. By 1902, Vogel had accumulated enough capital to purchase his first building, a decrepit tenement on Orchard Street that previous owners had abandoned as unrentable. Vogel made it rentable. He packed in twice as many families as the building was designed to hold. He ignored building codes that required ventilation and fire safety. When tenants complained, he told them to leave. They never left. They had nowhere to go. Over the next decade, Vogel accumulated 17 properties across the Lower East Side. His real estate empire was built on a simple principle: Human desperation was the most reliable investment in New York City. While other landlords maintained at least minimal standards, Vogel pioneered what housing reformers called the Vogel model: extract maximum rent while providing minimum services. He became wealthy. He married Greta Hoffmann, daughter of a German beer distributor. He purchased a brownstone on the Upper East Side, far from the tenements that funded his lifestyle. He wore tailored suits. He joined the German-American Business Association. He attended the opera. But Vogel could never quite escape his origins. His fellow businessmen smiled to his face while mocking his Pomeranian accent behind his back. The more established German-American families never truly accepted him into their social circles. He was new money. Tenement money. Dirty money. This isolation festered. Vogel began to hate the very people who made him rich, the tenement dwellers who reminded him of what he'd once been. He raised rents aggressively. He evicted families in winter. When his buildings needed repairs, he did nothing until the city threatened legal action. By 1912, Heinrich Vogel owned some of the worst housing stock in Manhattan. Building inspectors had cited him 127 times for code violations. Housing reformers used photographs of his properties in presentations about urban blight. Jacob Riis, the famous journalist and social reformer, wrote that Vogel's tenements represent the absolute nadir of human habitation in the modern world. Vogel didn't care. The rents kept flowing. The money kept accumulating. What no one knew was that Heinrich Vogel was planning something that would transform him from exploitative landlord into something far worse: a domestic terrorist who would weaponize rabies itself. The trigger: a business dispute turns personal. The event that sparked the Pomeranian Plague began on July 3, 1912, with a seemingly minor business dispute. Vogel's most profitable building was 247 Rivington Street, a 7-story tenement housing 156 residents in 31 apartments. The building generated $520 per month in rent, an enormous sum. Vogel had owned it outright for 8 years. But there was a problem. The building's foundation was failing. The basement flooded during every heavy rain. The ground floor apartments had begun to sink, creating a distinctive slant visible to anyone who paid attention. The city building department had issued an ultimatum: repair the foundation within 6 months or face condemnation. The repair would cost approximately $8,000, more than a year's rent from the property. Vogel refused. Instead, he attempted to sell the building to Ludwig Steinberg, another tenement landlord who specialized in buying distressed properties. Steinberg offered $12,000. Vogel accepted. The sale was scheduled to close on August 1, 1912. But something went wrong. During the final inspection, Steinberg's engineer discovered something Vogel hadn't disclosed. The foundation wasn't just failing. It was built on illegally filled wetland. The entire structure was sinking into what had once been a creek bed. Repairs weren't possible. The building would need to be demolished and rebuilt from scratch. Steinberg withdrew his offer. Vogel was trapped. He owned a building he couldn't sell and couldn't afford to repair. The city condemnation process would begin within months. He faced losing not just the property but potentially his entire real estate portfolio if the city decided to audit his other buildings. For a man who had clawed his way out of poverty through sheer ruthless determination, this represented an unbearable humiliation. He blamed everyone: Steinberg for backing out, the city inspectors for being too strict, the tenants for complaining about conditions, the reformers for turning public opinion against landlords like himself. But mostly he blamed the tenants of 247 Rivington Street. In Vogel's twisted logic, they had caused the foundation problems by overloading the building with their bodies, their belongings, their very existence. They had complained to the city about conditions, triggering the inspections. They had destroyed his property through their filthy living habits. They deserved to be punished. What authorities would later piece together suggests that Heinrich Vogel conceived his revenge plot sometime in mid-July 1912. He spent weeks planning every detail with the same meticulous care he'd applied to building his real estate empire. He would teach them all a lesson they'd never forget: escalating incidents. Incident 1: the dog breeder's visit. On July 18, 1912, a man matching Heinrich Vogel's description visited Wilhelm Krauss, a dog breeder specializing in Pomeranians who operated out of a small facility in Yonkers. Krauss later testified to police that the man introduced himself as Henry Vogel and claimed he wanted to purchase multiple Pomeranians as gifts for his daughter's upcoming birthday. This was believable. Pomeranians had become fashionable among New York's upper classes after Queen Victoria popularized the breed in England. He wanted small ones, Krauss recalled. He specified that he needed dogs under 10 pounds. He said his daughter preferred the smallest specimens available. The request was unusual. Most buyers wanted show-quality dogs with specific coloring and lineage. This buyer seemed interested only in size and number. "How many dogs can you provide?" a man asked. Kraus was taken aback. "Well, I have 12 Pomeranians currently, but surely you don't need 12 dogs for one girl?" The man smiled. "I'm planning a surprise. I want to give her one dog and gift the others to her friends at a party. It will be quite the spectacle." Something about the interaction made Kraus uneasy, though he couldn't articulate why. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. He showed no interest in seeing the dog's breeding papers or health certificates. He simply wanted to know, could Kraus provide 12 Pomeranians, and could he do it quickly? They agreed on a price of $360, $30 per dog. The man paid in cash from a thick wallet. They scheduled delivery for July 25th at an address in the Bronx, not Manhattan. After the man left, Kraus's wife asked him, "Why does someone need 12 identical small dogs?" Kraus had no answer. Incident 2, the mysterious kennel. On July 28th, residents of a working-class neighborhood in the Bronx began complaining about a terrible barking coming from a warehouse on Bruckner Boulevard. The building had stood empty for months after its previous tenant, a textile importer, had gone bankrupt. Mrs. Anna Kowalski, who lived in the apartment building adjacent to the warehouse, later told investigators, "It wasn't normal barking. It sounded wrong, desperate, like the dogs were in terrible pain." The barking continued day and night for nearly 3 weeks. Neighbors called the police twice, but officers found the warehouse locked with no signs of forced entry. Since the property owner lived in Philadelphia and couldn't be immediately reached, the police declined to break down the door for a noise complaint. "They told us to stuff cotton in our ears," Mrs. Kowalski recalled bitterly. What was happening inside that warehouse would only be discovered after the Rivington Street massacre, when investigators finally connected the threads. Heinrich Vogel had rented the space using a false name, H. Volkmann, and paid 6 months' rent in advance. Inside, he had constructed a makeshift kennel with crude wooden cages. He had purchased the 12 Pomeranians from Kraus and transported them to this facility. Then he had begun infecting them with rabies. Vogel obtained the rabies virus from an infected stray dog he'd captured near one of his properties. The methodology was crude but effective. He allowed the infected dog to bite each Pomeranian, then kept the smaller dogs isolated as the disease incubated. Rabies takes 3 to 8 weeks to fully develop in dogs after exposure. Vogel was patient. He visited the warehouse every few days to provide minimal food and water. He watched the dogs deteriorate. He observed as they became increasingly aggressive, as their behaviors changed, as the virus transformed them into biological weapons. The neighbors heard their suffering but did nothing. In the crowded chaos of New York, suffering was ambient noise. Incident 3, the practice run. On August 20th, a bizarre incident occurred at one of Vogel's other properties, a tenement at 153 Eldridge Street. Mrs. Esther Goldstein, a resident of the 3rd floor, discovered a small white dog in the building's hallway. The dog appeared disoriented and was drooling excessively. When Mrs. Goldstein approached it, the dog lunged at her, biting her hand before fleeing down the stairs. Mrs. Goldstein sought treatment at Gouverneur Hospital, where a doctor cleaned and bandaged the wound. The doctor asked if the dog was hers. "No," she told him. "I'd never seen it before. Someone must have left their door open." The doctor was concerned enough to ask, "Did the dog seem sick? Was it foaming at the mouth?" Mrs. Goldstein thought carefully. "It was drooling a lot, and its eyes looked strange, kind of cloudy." The doctor's concern deepened. "You need to find that dog. If it's rabid, you'll need to begin treatment immediately." Rabies treatment in 1912 was primitive and painful. A series of injections directly into the abdomen using a vaccine derived from infected rabbit spinal cords. The treatment lasted 2 weeks and often caused severe side effects. But without it, rabies was 100% fatal once symptoms appeared. Mrs. Goldstein returned to 153 Eldridge Street and searched for the dog. She knocked on every door. No one claimed the animal. No one had seen it enter the building. It had simply appeared and then vanished. A week later, Mrs. Goldstein began experiencing the early symptoms of rabies, fever, fatigue, and a strange tingling sensation around her bite wound. She returned to Gouverneur Hospital and began the agonizing treatment series. She survived. But the incident was never formally investigated. A single rabid dog in the tenements seemed like unfortunate happenstance, not evidence of something more sinister. It was, investigators would later realize, Vogel's test run. He had released a single infected dog in one of his buildings to observe how quickly it could spread the virus before being captured or killed. The answer, fast enough. Mrs. Goldstein's survival depended on her seeking immediate treatment. Most tenement residents avoided hospitals unless absolutely necessary. The costs were prohibitive, and many immigrants distrusted authorities. Vogel had learned what he needed to know. Incident 4, the final preparation. On September 14, 1912, 3 days before the attack, Heinrich Vogel visited 247 Rivington Street personally, something he rarely did. Building superintendents typically handled the day-to-day management of his properties. The superintendent, a man named Karl Brenner, later recalled the visit in detail. Mr. Vogel arrived around noon. He said he wanted to personally inspect the building before the city's next visit. He spent an hour walking through every floor, examining the hallways, checking the layout. What Brenner didn't realize was that Vogel was mapping the building's interior. He was counting apartments. He was noting which doors faced which hallways. He was planning optimal placement. Vogel also made a curious inquiry. How many tenants are typically home during weekday afternoons? Brenner found the question odd but answered, most of the men work in factories, so they're gone. But the women and children, they're always here. The building's always full. Always full, Vogel repeated as if testing the phrase. Good. On September 16th, Vogel returned to the Bronx warehouse one final time. The 12 Pomeranians were fully symptomatic now. Aggressive, disoriented, hypersalivating. The furious stage of rabies had taken hold. The dogs were no longer pets. They were weapons. Vogel had constructed special wooden transport crates with handles and latches that could be opened remotely using a string mechanism. He loaded each rabid Pomeranian into its own crate. Then he loaded all 12 crates into a covered delivery wagon he'd rented using another false identity. At dawn on September 17th, Heinrich Vogel drove that wagon to Rivington Street and parked in the alley behind 247. He waited until 2:00 p.m., a time when most men were at work but families remained home. Then he carried the crates inside, one at a time, placing them strategically throughout the building, 2 in the ground floor hallway, 2 on the second floor landing, 2 on the third, and so on, up to the 6th floor. Each crate had a timer mechanism Vogel had jury-rigged using basic clockwork. At precisely 2:30 p.m., all 12 crates would spring open simultaneously. 12 rabid dogs would be released into a building packed with women and children. Heinrich Vogel walked out of 247 Rivington Street at 2:27 p.m. He climbed into his delivery wagon and drove away calmly, like a man finishing routine business. 3 minutes later, the building began to scream. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and let us know in the comments what you think drove Vogel to such calculated evil. Share this with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. They won't believe this actually happened. Let's discover what authorities found when they finally pieced together the full horror. Dr. Samuel Weissman would later describe September 17, 1912, as the day hell opened in Manhattan. When he arrived at 247 Rivington Street around 3:30 p.m., the chaos was beyond comprehension. Police had cordoned off the entire block, but crowds pressed against the barriers, trying to see what was happening. Ambulances clogged the street. The screaming continued from upper floors. Weissman was a physician at Gouverneur Hospital, specializing in infectious diseases. He'd been summoned by a panicked police lieutenant who could only say, "We have multiple bite victims, a lot of them. Something's very wrong." The scene inside the lobby made Weissman's stomach lurch. 4 bodies lay on the floor, covered with sheets already soaked through with blood. A police officer sat against the wall, clutching his torn arm, his face sheet white. A woman held her screaming child, both covered in bite marks. "What the hell happened here?" Weissman demanded. The officer gestured weakly toward the stairs. "Dogs, small dogs, white ones. They're everywhere in the building. They're attacking everyone." "What kind of dogs?" "I don't know, little fluffy ones." From inside apartments came the sounds of furniture being overturned, glass breaking, and that terrible guttural snarling that didn't sound like any dog Weissman had ever heard. In apartment 2C, they found Mrs. Rosa Leibowitz backed into a corner, using a broom to fend off 2 small white dogs. The dog's fur was matted with blood and foam. Their eyes had a milky yellowed appearance. They moved with jerky, uncoordinated motions, lunging, retreating, lunging again. One of the officers drew his service revolver and fired twice. Both dogs went down. Mrs. Leibowitz collapsed, sobbing. Her arms and legs were covered with deep bite wounds. "Get her to the ambulance," Weissman ordered. "Tell them possible rabies exposure. She needs treatment immediately. They moved through the building floor by floor. What Weissman witnessed would haunt him for the rest of his life. On the 3rd floor they found a child, a boy no older than 6, dead in the hallway. A white Pomeranian stood over the body, its muzzle buried in the child's torn throat. When officers approached, the dog attacked with such ferocity that it took 4 gunshots to put it down. On the 4th floor, they discovered a woman who had barricaded herself in a bathroom. Through the door she described what had happened. The box just opened. I heard a click and the door flew up. This little dog came out, but it wasn't acting like a dog. It was confused and angry. Then it saw my son and just attacked. It went for his face. There was so much blood. Her son, 8-year-old David Klein, had massive facial trauma. Weissman knew immediately that even if the boy survived his injuries, if the dog was rabid, he had perhaps a week before symptoms appeared. Then the boy would die in agony. By 5:00 p.m., police had shot and killed 9 of the 12 dogs. 2 remained at large somewhere in the building. 1 had escaped into the street and disappeared into the Lower East Side's maze of alleys. The final toll that day, 13 dead. 8 children, 5 adults, 47 people bitten or scratched, an entire community traumatized beyond measure. But the horror was only beginning. The medical crisis. Rabies is one of nature's most perfect killers. Once symptoms appear, typically 1-3 months after exposure, death is virtually certain. The virus attacks the central nervous system, causing acute inflammation of the brain. Victims experience hydrophobia, fear of water, confusion, hallucinations, and extreme agitation. They die in agony, usually from respiratory failure. The only hope for bite victims is immediate post-exposure, prophylaxis, the painful series of injections Mrs. Goldstein had received weeks earlier. But the treatment only works if administered before symptoms appear. Dr. Weissman faced an impossible decision. Which of the 47 bite victims were truly at risk? Not every bite from a rabid animal transmits the virus. The transmission rate is roughly 15 to 30%, depending on the severity and location of the wound. Bites near the head are most dangerous, because the virus has less distance to travel to reach the brain. Deep wounds are worse than superficial scratches. But they couldn't test the dogs for rabies definitively without specialized laboratory analysis that would take days. They couldn't wait days. Weissman made the call. Every victim would receive treatment. Gouverneur Hospital didn't have enough rabies vaccine for 47 people. Neither did any other hospital in Manhattan. The city's entire supply would be exhausted treating just the Rivington Street victims. New York's health commissioner, Dr. Ernst Lederle, took emergency action. He telegraphed the Pasteur Institute in Paris and the New York State Department of Health. He arranged for emergency vaccine production and transport. Within 48 hours, enough vaccine arrived to begin treatment for all victims, but 3 people refused treatment. 2 were adults who simply didn't believe the dogs were rabid. They'd looked like harmless pets. 1 was a young mother who'd been bitten while protecting her children. She couldn't afford to miss 2 weeks of work for the treatment series. She had no one to care for her children during the hospital visits. Her name was Sarah Kowalski. She died on October 23, 1912, 36 days after the attack. The rabies killed her slowly. First came fever and headaches, then confusion and agitation, then the hydrophobia. She couldn't swallow water, couldn't bear the sight of it. She died thrashing and screaming, terrified of invisible threats only she could see. Her 3 children became orphans. The youngest was 4 months old. Investigation aftermath, 1,200 words remaining. The investigation began within hours of the attack. Detective Thomas O'Reilly of the NYPD's Detective Bureau took lead. The first question, where did the dogs come from? The answer emerged quickly. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the wooden crates in the hallways. The crates all bore a manufacturer's mark, a label from Myers Woodworking in the Bronx. Police tracked down the company and learned that a man matching Vogel's description had purchased 12 special crates with timed release mechanisms 3 weeks earlier. The second question, who placed them in the building? Superintendent Carl Brenner provided the answer. He remembered Vogel's strange visit on September 14th. He described the landlord's unusual questions about tenant schedules. When detectives showed him photographs of the crate mechanisms, Brenner went pale. "He was planning this," Brenner whispered. "He walked through my building planning how to kill them." The third question, where did Vogel get rabid dogs? This took longer to uncover. Detectives traced the Bronx warehouse rental through banking records. When they finally broke into the facility on September 20th, they found the makeshift kennel, The cages caked with excrement and blood, and, most damning, Vogel's planning notes. He'd kept a journal documenting everything. The purchase from Kraus, the infection process, his observations about rabies progression, his calculations about optimal release timing, his reasoning for targeting 247 Rivington Street specifically. One entry dated September 10th was particularly chilling. They complain about rats and vermin in the walls. I will give them vermin they won't forget. These dogs will teach them that their comfort means nothing. Their complaints have cost me everything. Now I will cost them everything. The small ones will bite the children most easily. This is intentional. Let the mothers watch their children die as I have watched my empire crumble. It wasn't madness. It was calculation. The manhunt. Heinrich Vogel disappeared on September 17th, immediately after releasing the dogs. He never returned to his Upper East Side brownstone. His wife, Greta, claimed complete ignorance of his plans, and investigators found no evidence she was involved. Police issued a nationwide alert. Vogel's photograph appeared in newspapers across the country. The headline in the New York Times on September 19th read, "Landlord wanted for mass murder by rabid dog." The manhunt lasted 3 weeks. On October 8, 1912, a railroad worker in Scranton, Pennsylvania spotted a man matching Vogel's description boarding a westbound freight train. Local police surrounded the train at the next stop. They found Vogel in a boxcar, emaciated and filthy. He'd been living as a hobo, hiding in rail yards and abandoned buildings. When officers arrested him, he didn't resist. He simply said, "It doesn't matter now. They know what it feels like." The trial of Heinrich Vogel began on November 20th, 1912, in New York County Criminal Court. Prosecutor William Travers Jerome, famous for his prosecution of Harry Thaw, personally handled the case. Vogel's defense attorney, Martin Schultz, attempted an insanity defense. He argued that no sane person would conceive such a plot. He brought psychiatrists who testified about Vogel's delusional persecution complex. The prosecution countered with Vogel's journal entries. They demonstrated meticulous planning, careful execution, and clear consciousness of guilt. He'd fled and hidden, proving he knew his actions were criminal. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Guilty on 13 counts of first-degree murder, Judge Theodore Bingham sentenced Vogel to death by electric chair. Before sentencing, Bingham addressed Vogel directly. "You have committed an act so depraved, so calculated, and so cowardly that language fails to capture its enormity. You weaponized disease against innocent children. You turned man's best friend into instruments of death. You have forfeited any claim to human compassion or mercy." Vogel showed no emotion. He simply asked when. "As soon as the law allows," Bingham replied. Heinrich Vogel was executed at Sing Sing Prison on March 14, 1913, 6 months after the Rivington Street massacre. His last words were, "They destroyed me first." No one claimed his body. He was buried in the prison cemetery with a numbered marker instead of a name. Broader implications. The Pomeranian Plague fundamentally changed multiple aspects of American society. Legal reforms. Within months of Vogel's execution, New York State passed the Rabies Control Act of 1913, requiring mandatory licensing and vaccination of all dogs in urban areas. The law also established strict penalties for anyone who deliberately exposed humans or animals to rabies. The case established legal precedent for prosecuting bioterrorism before the term bioterrorism existed. Vogel was the first person in American history convicted of deliberately weaponizing an infectious disease. Tenement reforms. The massacre gave housing reformers the ammunition they needed. Jacob Riis wrote a scathing editorial titled "The Price of Exploitation," arguing that Vogel was a symptom of a system that valued profit over human life. New York City formed a special commission to investigate tenement conditions. The commission's report, published in May 1913, led to stricter building codes, mandatory inspections, and, most significantly, rent control measures designed to limit landlord exploitation. The Vogel buildings became symbols of urban blight. The city eventually seized all 17 of his properties and demolished them. 247 Rivington Street was torn down in 1914. A public school now stands on the site. The victims. Of the 47 people bitten, 2 developed rabies despite treatment. Sarah Kowalski died, as mentioned. The second victim was a man named Abraham Stein, who had delayed seeking treatment for 3 days because he didn't think his minor scratches warranted concern. He died on November 4, 1912. 15 survivors suffered permanent physical disabilities from their wounds, missing fingers, facial scarring, and nerve damage. Many more carried psychological trauma for life. The community of 247 Rivington Street never recovered. Most families moved away immediately, even before the building was condemned. They couldn't bear to live where their neighbors had died. A pattern revealed. Perhaps most disturbing, the investigation revealed that Vogel's crime wasn't unique, only his method was. Detectives uncovered a pattern of suspicious illness outbreaks in several of Vogel's other buildings, a typhoid fever cluster at 153 Eldridge Street in 1910, a suspected arsenic poisoning incident at 89 Orchard Street in 1911. Each outbreak had been attributed to the general poor conditions of tenement life, but the journal suggested something darker. One cryptic entry from March 1911 read, "The rats in Orchard's tea have access to the ground meal stores. This is useful to know." Had Vogel been experimenting with biological attacks for years? How many deaths attributed to urban disease were actually murder? We'll never know. The investigation ended with Vogel's execution, and no one wanted to keep digging into the past. The Pomeranian Plague of 1912 stands as one of the most premeditated acts of domestic terrorism in American history. A crime born not from sudden rage but from methodical, calculated revenge. Heinrich Vogel believed he'd been wronged by a system that had enriched him. Rather than accept responsibility for his own exploitation of the vulnerable, he turned his rage on the most innocent victims, the children living in his crumbling tenements. 15 people died. Dozens more carried physical and emotional scars for life. An entire community was destroyed. And yet, this story has been largely forgotten. It doesn't appear in most history books. The Rivington Street massacre was overshadowed by World War I just 2 years later. The victims were poor immigrants, people history often forgets. What do you think drove Heinrich Vogel to such evil? Was it pure revenge, or something darker? Could something like this happen today? Leave your theories in the comments below. Our community of mystery seekers always has fascinating insights. If this story disturbed you as much as it disturbed us, subscribe to Fear's Sermon for more lost chapters of American history that deserve to be remembered. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our next descent into darkness. See you in the next video. Until then, stay curious and stay careful.